Welcome to the narration of my July 2024 essay called Learning to Teach. Last month, I wrote about teaching students to learn instead of teaching them individual skills. This month, I want to expand that theme to include learning how to teach or developing the skill of teaching movement. When you're teaching a class, it can be easy to forget that the skill that you're practicing isn't the one that you're teaching your students. Even if your teaching style is mostly demonstration or instruction, you're still engaged in the skill of teaching. Hopefully, you recognize that the process you went through to learn a skill was unique to you, and that each of your students develops physical skills differently than you did, and differently from each other. With that recognition, it's easy to see that a teacher's role in movement classes is guiding student practice more than it is describing what should be happening. In my opinion, this also means that teaching is primarily a social skill, not a technical one. It doesn't take much to see how a one-arm handstand works, or the steps that make a particular wrap in fabric. It doesn't matter how well you or your students understand a skill. What matters is your ability to scaffold their practice, their willingness to go through repetition, their approach to failure, and their attitude towards their own body. These are all things that a coach can influence. Like any skill, random practice is going to get you somewhere, but intentional practice will get you somewhere you want to go. Your ability to teach will change the most through constructive practice, where you evaluate each teaching session using a set of criteria, and then you make adjustments to match whatever criteria you've chosen. I'm not here to tell you what that criteria is, or what criteria you should use to evaluate your teaching, and I'm not going to preach about the values that I think should guide teaching. If your goal is to produce Olympic athletes at all costs, then you're going to evaluate your coaching practice based on that. If your goal is to retain students, it's pretty clear whether or not you're succeeding at that. If your goal is to increase your students' technical ability, that's a different goal than helping a student become a professional performer. That's a different goal than fostering a practice where students can participate in the activity throughout their lifespan. Every teacher can pick their own goal and their own set of values. And while I will definitely own up to a desire to influence those values, in the end, that choice is totally yours. The thing that isn't optional is the process that we go through as we learn to teach. That process is going to occur whether or not you bring any intentionality to it. You're going to attempt to teach, you're going to evaluate your teaching, and you're going to adjust your teaching. Even if you skip the evaluation step, you're still going to adjust and teach again. Your teaching is just going to be a series of random experiments, most likely emulating your teacher's style and maybe avoiding some of the practices that they used that hurt you personally. Even if you are consistently evaluating your teaching on intentional criteria, actually adjusting your teaching to match it can be a scary process, especially when your teaching is your livelihood, and especially if your students have expectations of a certain teaching style. The point is that attempt, evaluate, adjust is a process that's going to occur regardless of whether you engage with it intentionally. The more intentionality we bring to it, the more our teaching can come into line with our values and our goals. This isn't unique to teaching. All skill development is going to work this way. I want to take a moment to notice that coaching skilled movement is going to be a little bit different than instructing a yoga class or training someone's strength or flexibility. The distinction between an instructor, a teacher, a coach, and a trainer might be important here and is worth considering as you examine your own teaching practice. The relevant difference here is that training or instruction are not necessarily social in the way that coaching is. Instruction can be asynchronous. You could make a YouTube yoga class, for example. And training can be an entirely asocial process where I just set a training regime for my students or for athletes and then look at their records as they go through the different workouts and change their workouts based on their numbers. There's not necessarily anything social in either of those processes. That said, the process of learning how to instruct an online yoga class or learning how to train an athlete through logs and plans is subject to the same learning cycle as learning to teach. And some of the same forces are going to influence that cycle if it's not undertaken with intentionality. Intentionality is especially important for teaching skilled movement because without intentionality, your teaching is going to be influenced by factors that affect all social exchanges. For example, the expectations of your students or their parents if the students are young, the way that you were taught by your teachers, and the omnipresent force of the larger culture. I want to unpack each of these factors in turn and talk about how they can influence learning to teach. Let's start with student expectations. We all feel pressure to fulfill our students' expectations, and it's worth unpacking where those expectations come from, especially if we're talking about newer movement disciplines like circus, pole, parkour, or acrobatics. Most people might know what to expect from, say, a Zumba class or a yoga class, but it's unlikely that they know what to expect from circus, pole, or parkour. What an awesome gift that lack of student expectation could be if we took advantage of it. If we agree that teaching is a social skill and not just a technical skill, then we should acknowledge that our students' expectations are playing a role in determining how we teach. If you ask your students a question and they don't say anything, you just get crickets in response, you might be tempted to abandon that question and give them direct instruction instead, thereby meeting their expectations that they're going to be told what to do in class. This tendency to meet their expectations can be exacerbated by the fact that your students are probably paying you money to be in class, and so you want them to get their money's worth. At one point in my own teaching, I asked myself, how would I change my teaching if my students' learning was more important than giving them their money's worth? I think this question digs at the root of capitalism's silent structuring of how we teach and learn and how we think about teaching and learning, and also pretty much anything else. Capitalism has an influence on our social interactions, creating the idea that a skill can and should be bought and sold, that learning is a service or a commodity rather than a social practice or a way of engaging with other people. When a student pays a teacher, the implication is that the teacher will provide a service, and that service will lead to the student's learning. In circus, that implication might be pay me, the teacher, and I will make you a superhuman athlete, or pay me and I will help you accomplish scary things, or pay me and I will make you look like someone from Cirque du Soleil. A student might have expectations like these, and a circus teacher might feel pressure to meet those expectations, especially because money is involved. If you don't set thoughtful criteria for a successful class, then meeting these unspoken expectations will become the default criteria, how you judge your own success. And those expectations might not have anything to do with what you actually want from your own teaching practice. I think a lot of teacher burnout comes from unconsciously adjusting your own teaching values and your own teaching style to meet students' demands, rather than aligning them with your own thoughts about how learning is going to occur. For example, when do you introduce creative technique, like making up skills or poses? When do you introduce expressive movement, like moving to a rhythm or having your students move like water? Do you introduce this in the first class? Do you introduce it when a student is intermediate? Do you change that depending on what your students' expectations of you are? For another example, if you don't want to be a trick machine, it's worth asking yourself where your students' expectations around learning new tricks come from. You may have trapped yourself into being a trick machine by unconsciously setting the expectation that you're going to teach a new trick every class. Let's move on to talking about how teaching traditions can influence our teaching. Custodial is the word for preserving a teaching tradition, emulating what and how your teachers taught you. It's easy to forget that within our own lifetimes, circus arts have gone from an entirely oral tradition passed down mostly by families or state-sponsored schools to a widely accessible skill set of movement disciplines that are only loosely bound to their former associations with performance. The traditions of teaching that used to exist aren't always a bad thing. For example, one of my coaches had a particular shoulder massage technique, presumably handed down to them by their coaches, which absolutely 100% relieved handstand-related shoulder pain for me in a way that physical therapists hadn't been able to. Many circus coaches have weird skills like this that are either handed down to them by their coaches or developed in their own practice, and some of those skills have deep histories, cultural significance, or importance in a traditional mode. These skills are often lost as circus disciplines and skills become commodities in a marketplace of fitness, fulfillment, or professional performance, and as oral tradition gives way to written tradition and social media. Without intentionality, most teachers may default to this custodial way of teaching, emulating their teachers. At its best, this approach preserves culturally important and effective practices while discarding injurious and ineffective ones. But at its worst, custodial teaching keeps the baby, the bathwater, and the dirt without any consideration of what practices are good or bad. I think it's appropriate to take a tensioned approach to tradition. I'll share classic Russian handstand drills, and then I have my students try them with bent elbows. I'll have days where contortionists use tension and release, and I'll have days where we hold passive stretches for a really long time. My teachers would always put conditioning at the end of classes or lessons, but I do conditioning at the start of my classes. My teachers would always give really specific instruction and teach a new trick every class, and I almost exclusively teach through inquiry and having my students direct their own way through a lesson. I'm not specifically recommending any of these practices, and I'm not saying they're superior. I'm just asking you to examine how much of your teaching is custodial and what pieces of your own teaching practice are uniquely yours. When did those unique practices emerge and why? Why have you chosen to keep part of your teacher's styles? Let's talk about the larger culture and the way it influences our practice. The larger culture will tell us stories about movement, bodies, and what it means to live a good or fulfilling life. These stories can sneak into your teaching style in subtle ways and affect your students' expectations, your own relationship with tradition, and some of the underlying influences of your teaching. Lots of narratives from the larger culture influence our movement teaching. Stories about what to eat, what healthy bodies look like, what a teacher is, how a teacher behaves, the value of movement. Your teaching will either prop up these narratives or tension against them, and I believe that what we learn in movement class influences how we see the larger world and how we move through it. By extension, how we choose to teach will influence our students, and we can only learn to reflect those values by engaging intentionally with learning how to teach. Let's look at an example. One of the stories present in Larger Culture Day is that science is the be-all, end-all of knowledge about motor learning and body movement. This is a pretty well-accepted story, and for some good reasons. Medical science and technology have changed the world for the better in some fundamental ways. We have learned a lot from science about how bodies work and about building strength or flexibility. But as all the good scientists I've ever met will admit, sometimes the things that we think we've learned from science are wrong. And there's a lot of room for bias, classism, supremacist, or colonial agendas to get baked into how science gets carried out and what results from science are accepted by the larger culture. In movement teaching, I'll often see science used as a cudgel to gain social cachet or authority, sometimes at the expense of traditional teachers who grew up training these skills and who are inheritors of a more oral tradition that stretches back generations. Who knows more about flexibility? A rhythmic gymnastics coach, a Mongolian contortion coach, or the doctor who researches flexibility? Which of those people would you want treating an injury? Which would you want giving you conditioning routines? What are the assumptions that you're bringing to the table when you answer those questions? My intention with this example isn't anti-science. Vaccines are good, medicine is good. I'm more pro-examining the way that traditional and practical knowledge. I'm more pro-examining traditional and practical knowledge and acknowledging that the process of knowledge generation through science sounds great in a vacuum, but that the reality is that the science that gets recorded is still very young compared to the traditions of movement teaching that have existed for centuries. The base of traditional knowledge should be co-constructive with science, not at odds with it. I don't think we should use science to disparage traditional knowledge. I think we should use the notion that science builds on and examines traditional knowledge in order to refine and influence it. I'll end this essay by re-emphasizing that teaching is an embedded social practice, not an intellectual exercise. What we do in the moment with our students isn't something we can always think about or plan for. We make mistakes, we'll handle things in weird ways, and we're generally going to make teaching up as we go along. I don't think it's worth spending endless time thinking about or mulling over your teaching. Rather, I think it's good to recognize that lots of things influence your teaching, and that maybe, just maybe, one of the things that influences your teaching should be you, what you believe, and what your values are. I think it's also valuable to recognize that thinking about your teaching isn't the thing that really changes your teaching. Practicing your teaching intentionally is what changes your teaching. With a little bit of attention, your teaching can become more than a random series of try this and I learned it this way. And maybe if you bring some intentionality to examining, evaluating, and changing your teaching, you'll learn something about yourself or the world along the way. Thanks for tuning in.